Hey everyone, welcome back to our continued Graptopetalum Care Guide series here on the Cali Plants channel. And for today's video, we're gonna be talking about our Graptopetalum Superbum. So you can see here, this is my Superbum. This is actually two different plants that I bought at different times. I just planted them closely here together so that they are in the same pot and I can save some space here at the greenhouse. And you can see here that this plant is actually a wide rosette type of succulent type of Graptopetalum. It has this purplish bluish farina, which is really beautiful, and it's got these flat leaves compared to our Graptopetalums, which could have rounded leaves. This one has these really flat shaped rosettes. Let me also just add on the appearance of this plant. You can see here that the stems it has are really dark colored. So if you're not used to dark colors on stems, you might be taken aback with these plants, because if you remove the farina on the stems, it really is dark colored. But that doesn't mean that it's rotting. That's just the natural appearance of the plant stems. It really is dark colored. So it might be hard to identify if it's rotting because the stems are already dark colored under its purplish farina. Another thing with the Superbum is that it's more of an upright grower compared to our other Graptopetalums, which might trail as they become older. Our Superbum will pretty much stay upright over the course of its entire life. So just so you know, we're going to be talking about this plant's origin, description, and also I will be giving you tips on making its potting mix, on its sun exposure, and also on its watering needs. And later on in this video, we're going to be talking about this plant's propagation and the problems that you might find with these succulents. So please make sure to watch until the end. On this plant's origin, this was actually first described by Kimnach on 1987. It was most probably a Mexican species of Graptopetalum. This used to be actually a subspecies of Graptopetalum pentandrum, but I think that currently it's actually being considered as a separate species, since the pentandrum is actually a very different succulent. It has a very different look to it. So I think we can consider the Superbum as actually a separate species already. On this plant's flowers is actually true to its Graptopetalum genus, which we know Graptopetalum means marked flowers. So this one actually has these really marked flowers, and much like with our other Graptopetalums, the flowers of this plant can tend to go branching out of the stem and not growing on a tall bloom stalk, much like our sedums or echeverias. So as with other Graptopetalums, it has these branching out flower stalks. Now that we're done with this plant's description, let's go over its care needs. And when it comes to its potting mix, I would recommend our usual 7 parts pumice and 3 parts organic material. So on the organic material, I would recommend cocoa peat or carbonized rice hull or vermicast, or a combination of those. You can also try adding less cocoa peat so that the plant won't stay wet for very long. In my experience, I feel like it's a much more slower plant when it comes to rooting, and it's more sensitive when it comes to its potting mix. I had this in a different potting mix before, which is more, how would I say this, more gritty, so it had less organic materials in it, and the plant didn't perform very well. Actually, you can see here that this is already a very old plant and it hasn't produced a lot of development. Actually, I think that the stem became thicker, but the leaves and the rosette size hasn't grown a lot in my care. So probably because it's also in the middle of the summer, which is why I'm not seeing a lot of development with this plant. But I think that compared with my other Graptopetalums, it's much more difficult. It needs a little more care and a little bit more attention when it comes to its potting mix. So since it was not performing very well in its older potting mix, I had it transferred into this new potting mix, which has carbonized rice hull and which has alnus compost in it. So I think that it's still rooting. You can see that the leaves are very dry. I had this watered about a few days ago and I don't think that it's dry already. So I think that I'm gonna be putting this in a shaded area while it's recovering, because it's still rooting in this pot. Now I can also say that adding alnus compost into your potting mix is actually good for succulents, because it holds onto the moisture and the succulent roots can really attach well into their potting mix if it has alnus compost. When it comes to this plant sun exposure, I would recommend you give it direct morning light and then filtered sun for the whole day, because I believe that it's very sensitive when it comes to the heat, so it doesn't take to a lot of heat. I would really recommend that if you can give it some shade, some protection during the extremely hot parts of the day, it would be really good for this succulent, because as I was observing this plant, I think that it really stops its growth when it stays in very extreme hot situations for very long. So this one, I've told you earlier that it hasn't produced a lot of growth, maybe because I've been keeping it in a very sunny location since I was trying to retain its farina on there. So because the farina actually becomes much more thicker with more sun, so I've been trying to get its farina to become clean, become beautiful, so I've been giving it a lot of sun, but in turn that made the plant slower. Now also, you want to give it as much consistent light as possible because you can see here that the plant has a tendency to etiolate very quickly, so it has this tendency to grow leaves that are separate to each other. It doesn't stay compact very well, and compared with our other rosette type succulents, this one really doesn't close its rosette, so it's actually a very flat open type rosette, much like here. So I think that even if you give this consistent light, I think the plant will really etiolate, will really grow upright. It won't stay compact for very long. On this plant's watering, I would recommend that you check the bottom leaves of the plant to see if it's really thirsty. So you can see here that this plant of mine is really flappy, so that means that it's already thirsty. If the leaf snaps back when pulled, when you push at it, that means the leaf is still thick, it doesn't need watering. So you can check that, the bottom part of the leaf, and also the potting mix, you can check if it's dry already. So I have my chopstick here, so you can check if the ingredients in it, if the organic material in it doesn't have moisture already, so you can already give this watering. Now I would only recommend that you give this watering during the cooler parts of the day, probably early in the morning or late at night. And also I would recommend that you give it more water if the weather is already mild, if it's not the extremely hot part of the summer, because I think that it will drop its leaves if you give it a lot of water during the summer, because it will be dormant during the summer. This is actually a winter growing succulent, but I don't think that Graptopetalums really stop growing all year long, because compared with our other succulents like Echeverias and sedums, which are very sensitive when it comes to their growing season, Graptopetalums are not so much like that. They can pretty much produce new growth all year long, even if it's summer or even if it's winter. It's just that they will grow more during the winter, so you might want to give them more water if it's the winter or if the months are cooler. When it comes to propagating the succulent, once you manage to acclimate it well and it's established in your care, it's gotten really thick with its leaves, it's got really thick leaves, then you can probably start propagating it. The leaves, I believe, once they are full grown, if you take one, it will propagate very easily, very quickly, because this is such a very vigorous grower. If the plant is still small, much like this one, you can see here that it's still small, I don't think that you will have very much high success when it comes to propagating it, since the leaves have very little energy in them. So I actually would wait for this to grow a little more before I would start propagating it. But also, if you don't want to try leaf propagation, you can behead this plant. So I believe that this one here, this two-headed succulent, actually used to be one stem because it had a stub underneath it, and I believe that that one stem got cut off, so it produced these two heads. So it really propagates well when it comes to beheading. So if this one becomes very tall to my liking, then I will probably cut it somewhere at the height that I want it, and if it becomes too leggy, then I will cut it off, and then from that leggy part, new heads will emerge. So once the plant is really established, if the plant is not yet established, I would also recommend you avoid beheading, because if the plant isn't rooted well, then the stem can die if it doesn't have roots and you behead it already, because it doesn't have any much storage of energy left because you remove the head. So I would recommend that you really wait for this one to establish before you start propagating it. Now, going into the problems of this plant, like I said before, it's actually much more sensitive compared with our other Graptopetalums. So you can see here, I haven't had a lot of issues with this one. They've been very consistent in my care, but this one really sensitive, really slow growing. So you have to be a little bit more patient with it. It's not very sensitive when it comes to burning, but the growth will really stop if it gets a lot of heat. So I would recommend that you give it protection. Also, if you put it in a very shaded area, it can tend to etiolate very quickly. So you really have to be mindful of that. You really have to give it consistent filtered light so that it doesn't etiolate. You can also have edema on the leaves if you're putting your plant in a very humid location, but I think that is a very minor problem. You can see here that it's not very noticeable on this one because of the thick farina, but it's got some edema on it, and if the edema really multiplies, if you really keep it in a very humid location, then the plant may not be as beautiful as it should be because it has a lot of edema. So you want to give it less humidity if you're seeing edema on your plants, and you want to water it less frequently. On pests, you can also have problems with this on mealybugs, scale, aphids. So if you have that issue, you can just wash the plant with water and mixed with dishwashing soap. So I've tried that before. That's a really quick fix if you're seeing a lot of insects already. But if you really want your plant to avoid having an infestation, you can try adding Starkle G insecticide and spotting mix. That is a systemic insecticide that the plant can absorb through its roots and kill any insect that bites on the plants. So I would recommend Circle G. It's available on Shopee if you're living in the Philippines, and I think that it's also available in many countries around the world. On the shipping, I haven't had a lot of issues when receiving this plant from shipping. When it comes out of the box, it doesn't have a lot of mushiness on the 2 times that I received this through the mail. So I think that is very good when it comes to shipping. You can just expect the plant to dry out a few of its bottom leaves, and also since it's a very tall growing succulent, that when you receive it on shipping, it might be bent over in awkward positions, and also it might be difficult for you to plant it right away because it's such a tall, top heavy type of succulent. So if the plant you received in shipping is very tall and you don't want it to fall over when you plant it, I would recommend that you just cut the bottom part of the stem and you just plop it down onto the soil if it really is top heavy, because some succulents will come in shipping looking like that. Or if you don't want to remove any stem on the plant, you can also try investing in stem supports. So there are already available stem supports in Shopee. I think in Ma'am Dorothy Dugenia Mercado, if you're living in the Philippines, she has a Shopee account which sells stem support on succulents, which is very tall. So you can put that much like a hook or much like a stand on your potting mix, and then the plant will lean on that so that it won't fall over. So you can try that if the Superbum you buy is very tall already. Overall, I would say that the Graptopetalum Superbum is actually a very beautiful, very nice looking succulent with this purple leaf, which is really stunning. It's much more brighter compared with our other purple type succulents. So it's one that will really make an impression on your garden if you add this to your collection. So I would really recommend this plant. You only have to be mindful when it's still acclimating. You have to give it some protection, but once you manage to establish it well, you can pretty much expect it to produce a lot of growth because it's a very vigorous grower, much like with our other Graptopetalums. Now, if you have any other question when it comes to this succulent, if you have problems with it that I haven't discussed in this video, please make sure to comment it down below. But if you really like the tips that I gave you, and if you really like this plant, please make sure to hit the thumbs up, and also you can subscribe to this channel so you won't miss any other care guides that we'll be making in the future. So I think that's about it for this video, guys, and I will see you on the next one. Bye bye.